What's good, beautiful people? Black Thumb here, and today we are going to be talking about sunlight and its importance in helping your orchids thrive and grow and live their best lives. So what we're going to cover today is the importance of sunlight and how it fuels that growth in your orchids. We're also going to talk about the amount and types of light that orchids like so that they can continue to thrive. And then we'll finish up with a couple of methods on how you can specifically determine how much light your orchid is getting to make sure that it's getting just enough light or the right amount of light instead of too much or too little. And so for me personally, I definitely remember when I started my orchid journey, not really knowing what I was doing or how I was going to help these orchids thrive. But I knew one thing. I knew that they needed sunlight. And so then it was just a matter of figuring out how much light these orchids need. So let's start with the importance of sunlight and what sunlight does to promote growth in your orchids. So essentially what sunlight does is it fuels the process called photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is where when you water a plant, that water gets stored in its leaves or in its roots. And then through photosynthesis, that water is converted into sugars, which then becomes food to feed the plant and provide nutrients to the plant. Sunlight also, through photosynthesis, allows these plants to convert carbon dioxide to oxygen, which is what also helps us breathe and helps us stay alive. So sunlight is absolutely important and massively integral to the overall survival of all living things. And in particular, it's really important to the overall health and wellness of your orchids. So now let's talk about how much light orchids, and in particular Phalaenopsis orchids, need to have in order to thrive and be well and to bloom year over year. So most orchids, including Phalaenopsis orchids, thrive and do best when they are receiving bright indirect light. So what does that mean? So direct light would be if you put an orchid in the window and if the orchid had eyes, it can look at the sun and the sun can look right back at the orchid. Bright indirect light is where the orchid can take advantage of sunlight without being in view or receiving that direct sunlight. One of the reasons why we want to manage our sunlight for our orchids is because you can develop sunburn if an orchid gets too much light. Meaning the same way that we sunburn as humans, if we don't put our sunscreen on, if we're in the sun for too long and we start to peel and some of our skin starts to die off, the exact same thing happens with orchids when they receive full, bright, direct light. Where orchids do really well is if you have an east-facing window in your home, you can always put your orchids in that window because you're going to get the gentle morning sun, which is going to be a little bit less aggressive than, say, the afternoon sun that may be on the western side of your home. The other thing that you can do to kind of manage the amount of light that you have is you can use a sheer curtain to kind of filter some of the light that's coming in and out of your home. You can also put your orchid further away from that window, or if there are trees or bushes that can kind of create areas of sunlight, but also areas of shadow or shade, that is also a good strategy. And then finally, if you have blinds that you can adjust, where you can adjust the amount of light that comes in through those blinds, you can also use that as an opportunity or a way to filter your light so that you're not running the risk of sunburning your orchid leaves. Okay, so let's finish up with how do you determine how much light your orchid is getting and whether it's enough, too little, or too much. So there are two primary ways that I like to measure the amount of light that my orchid is receiving. So the first way is just using what we call a light meter. And what I like about this light meter is that it's 3-in-1. It has 3 functions. So you can measure the amount of moisture in your plant. So you literally just dip it into your plant. It'll tell you how wet the potting media is. But it'll also measure light and pH as well. And so for the conversation today, we are talking about sunlight. So I will put a link in the description of this product in particular because it has been such a lifesaver, and it really takes a lot of the guesswork out of a lot of my orchid care as it relates to when I should water, but also, is my orchid in a good spot? Is it getting enough sunlight? And so the way you use this light meter is you put it into the pot, you dip it down into the pot, you face the light meter where the light source is coming from, and then it's going to read out on this meter. Where I feel is the sweet spot for orchids is right kind of in the middle. And so that is using your light meter. It's quick, it's fast, it's easy, and this is a very, very inexpensive piece of equipment that can save you a bunch of time, but it can also save you a bunch of heartache and guesswork as it relates to your orchid care. Now, if you are looking for an absolutely free option on how to determine how much sunlight your orchid is receiving or getting throughout the day, then you can use what we call the shadow method. Basically, put your hand between the orchid and where the light source is coming, and based on the intensity of the shadow, that determines how much light your orchid is receiving. So, in the situation that your orchid is receiving full, bright, direct light, the lines of your shadow are going to be very defined and a lot sharper and much more intense. And then in the situation where your orchid is receiving bright, indirect light, which is the sweet spot for where orchids love to be from a sunlight standpoint, you're going to see a shadow. It'll be a little bit less aggressive and less intense, and the lines won't be quite as sharp. Now, if you're not getting any sunlight at all or not enough sunlight at all, you won't see a shadow when you put your hand up in between the orchid and the light source. That is sunlight in a nutshell. If you have other questions as it relates to sunlight and your orchids, do not hesitate to comment. And as always, make sure you like, subscribe, share. And I hope that helps and your orchids keep blooming.